I had spent years saving up for my private lake spot, the perfect escape from the chaos of city life. It was my sanctuary, tucked away behind tall pines and gentle hills, a quiet place where I could fish, swim, or just watch the sunset over the water. But that serenity vanished the moment I drove up last Saturday and saw the scene before me. HOA Karen, of course, was at the center of it, grinning smugly as if she had done me a favor. Her friends' cars lined the dirt path, and I could hear laughter echoing across the water. She had handed them my lake spot, my private property, completely free, like I didn't even exist. Anger hit me first, sharp and burning. My jaw tightened as I stepped out of my truck, the gravel crunching under my boots. I couldn't believe it. Karen had crossed every line imaginable, using her HOA authority to turn my sanctuary into a playground for her friends. This wasn't just rude, it was personal. Every smile, every laugh, every careless footstep on the dock felt like a punch to the gut. I called out, trying to reason with her. "Karen, what are you doing? That's my spot." Her laugh cut through the air. "Relax. They're just enjoying it. You don't need to make a big deal out of it," she said, brushing it off like my ownership meant nothing. I felt my blood boil. This wasn't just about rules or HOA bureaucracy, it was about respect, about boundaries, about my peace of mind. Karen had proven she had no respect for either, and her friends had no idea they were complicit in her chaos. I retreated to the edge of the water, watching them frolic, thinking. There was no arguing, no pleading, no civil compromise that would fix this. Karen had handed them my fun on a silver platter, and if I wanted it back, I had to act. I had to take control of the situation, and not in a small, half-hearted way. As I stood there, a plan started forming in my mind. It wasn't reckless, it wasn't impulsive, it was precise, calculated, and designed to make one thing crystal clear: nobody messes with my lake spot and gets away with it. By the time I got back to my truck, I knew exactly what I was going to do. This wasn't just about revenge, it was about sending a message Karen and her friends would never forget. And I was ready. I retreated to my truck, heart still pounding, and surveyed the lake. Karen and her friends were laughing, throwing ropes, tossing floaties, and clearly unaware that their fun was about to come to an abrupt end. I realized immediately that subtlety wouldn't work here. I needed precision, strategy, and a little bit of showmanship. This wasn't just about getting my lake spot back, it was about teaching a lesson no one would forget. First, I assessed the terrain. The lake wasn't just water, it was my canvas. I knew every inch of it: the shallow spots, the channels, the tiny dam I had installed years ago to control water levels. That knowledge was my edge. Karen didn't understand that lakes could be manipulated with patience and careful planning. She assumed access to water meant access to fun. She couldn't have been more wrong. I grabbed a notebook and started mapping everything out. Where they were docked, where they swam, where the floating platform bobbed, every detail mattered. My plan would rely on control, timing, and environmental leverage. I couldn't just drain the water recklessly; that would ruin the entire lake ecosystem and possibly land me in trouble. But I could lower it enough to make the dock unusable, the floaties useless, and their laughter fade into frustration. Then came the logistics. I checked the manual release on my small dam and made sure everything was functional. A few turns of the valves, and water levels would drop steadily. I calculated exactly how long it would take, how quickly it would affect the dock, and how long it would keep their feet wet and their fun interrupted. Next, I thought about presentation. Karen needed to see the consequences firsthand. It wasn't enough for her friends to complain, she had to witness the result of her arrogance. That meant timing, positioning, and staying out of sight until the moment the water began to disappear. By mid-afternoon, my plan was ready. I could practically see the sequence play out in my mind: Karen's initial disbelief, the scramble of her friends, the frantic attempts to salvage their floaties, and the slow realization that my lake, my rules, was finally back under my control. The adrenaline was intense, but I stayed calm. This wasn't chaos, it was strategy. One wrong move and it could all backfire, but I had accounted for every detail. Karen had crossed the line, and now, I would respond in kind. As the sun began to tilt toward the horizon, I hid behind the trees, ready to execute. This wasn't just about water, it was about respect, boundaries, and the undeniable lesson Karen would never forget. The moment had come. The sun hovered low, casting a warm orange glow across the lake, beautiful, serene, and completely unaware that its surface was about to shift. I crouched behind the thick pine trees, close enough to watch everything unfold but far enough to keep myself hidden until the right moment. My fingers rested on the manual release valve. One turn. That was all it would take to begin draining the water, just enough to ruin their fun. My heart raced, steady but strong, filled with purpose. I wasn't doing this out of spite, I was reclaiming what was mine. With a slow breath, I twisted the valve. A deep rumbling echoed through the pipe system, subtle enough to go unnoticed by Karen's group but unmistakable to me. Water began rushing out through the outflow duct, slipping quietly into the lower channel. A single drop in level, then another, then another. At first, nothing changed on the surface. Karen's friends splashed, shouted, and floated lazily as if they owned the place. But within minutes, small signs began appearing. The floating platform shifted at an odd angle. The ropes tied to the dock tightened. Ripples flattened, then stretched toward the receding shoreline. I watched closely as one of Karen's friends reached down, frowning. "Is it just me," she said, "or is the water lower?" Karen scoffed loudly. "Don't be ridiculous. It's a lake, it doesn't just shrink. You're imagining things." But the lake continued dropping. Slowly. Steadily. Unmistakably. Another 10 minutes passed, and now the shoreline had receded several feet. The once floating dock groaned as its underside scraped the mud. The platform leaned so far to the side that one of the guys slipped off with a splash, his floatie drifting away from him. That's when the chaos began. "Hey! What's happening? My float won't stay up. Why is the dock touching the ground?" Their confusion was priceless. Karen's confident smirk faded into pinched irritation, then confusion, then dawning alarm. She stared at the water line, squinting as if trying to argue with her own eyes. This isn't normal," she muttered. "No kidding." I kept watching, silent, savoring every second. The water continued its slow retreat, the lake's gentle slope exposing patches of muddy bank. Karen's friends scrambled, grabbing their things, slipping in the thickening mud. Finally, Karen threw her hands up. "Who did this?" The moment she said it, I stepped out from the trees. Not close enough to confront her yet, just enough so she knew someone was watching. Her eyes widened. She knew. And I smiled. Karen's mouth hung open, her eyes darting from the receding water to the muddy dock and back again. Her friends were slipping, stumbling, and flailing, some clutching deflated floaties while others waded through the exposed lake bed. The laughter and cheer from minutes ago had transformed into panic, confusion, and frustration. "I don't understand," one of her friends shouted, balancing on a slanted dock. "The water, it's just disappearing." Karen stomped toward the shoreline, pointing fingers at the mud as if she could summon the water back with sheer authority. "This isn't funny," she barked. "Someone is doing this. You can't, this is illegal." I stepped out fully from behind the trees this time, hands on my hips, surveying the chaos like a general watching an enemy falter. "Illegal?" I asked calmly. "This is my lake spot. My rules. You were enjoying it without permission. Seems like a fair consequence." Her face turned beet red, fury battling disbelief. She opened her mouth to argue, then realized that all the eyes of her friends were on her. They weren't laughing anymore, they were sliding through mud, clutching floaties, and cursing the situation. Karen's authority evaporated in the blink of an eye. I walked slowly toward the dock, careful not to get my boots stuck in the soft mud. The water had dropped enough that several floating platforms were grounded, their edges scraping against the sandy bottom. Her friends scrambled in every direction, some trying to salvage their floats, others attempting to pull the dock free. Every movement only sank them deeper into the mud. This can't be happening," Karen hissed, shaking her head. I gave them permission. "I'm HOA. You can't do this to me." "Permission?" I replied, gesturing to the chaos. "This is my property, Karen. Your permission means nothing here. And now you see the consequences of ignoring boundaries." Her friends had stopped arguing with me and were too busy wrestling with mud, floaties, and the shifting dock. Panic and confusion replaced their earlier confidence. Every splash, every slide, every frustrated yell underscored the lesson Karen had failed to enforce herself. I glanced back toward the valve release I had set earlier, the water continuing its steady retreat. The chaos was perfect. They were learning a lesson the hard way: no one messes with someone else's property without consequences. By the time the sun tilted lower in the sky, most of the water around the dock had drained enough that floaties were useless, the platforms grounded, and Karen's face was a mix of rage and humiliation. She had no words left, no authority left, and no control over her friend's predicament. And I stood there, calm, victorious, and completely in control of my lake. Karen's fury simmered as her friends waded through mud and tried to salvage the remains of their floating toys. But she wasn't the type to accept defeat gracefully. Her face twisted with determination, and I knew her next move would be desperate and potentially dramatic. She stormed toward me, her heels crunching in the sand, pointing a finger like a sword. "This isn't over. I'm the HOA. You can't just do this. You'll be hearing from the board." I crossed my arms, keeping my tone calm, deliberate. "I already have every legal right to this property, Karen. The board isn't going to change that. Your friends were trespassing. You'll have to explain that to them." Her friends, meanwhile, were sliding, slipping, and flailing, getting stuck in thick patches of mud. Some shouted at Karen, accusing her of getting them into trouble. "Karen, this is your fault," one yelled, sinking ankle deep. "You said it was fine." Her authority crumbled further. I could see it in her posture, the rigid confidence replaced with hesitation, embarrassment, and a growing sense of panic. She tried to rally her friends, pointing to the valve release near the dam, but none of them knew what it was for. The chaos was now entirely under my control. Then Karen grabbed a nearby paddle and attempted to steer the floating platform, trying to force it back into water. She slipped, fell, and landed with a splash, sending mud flying onto her clothes. Her friends froze in shock before bursting into helpless laughter at the absurdity of her struggle. I shook my head, letting the lesson sink in. "Sometimes, Karen," I said, "trying to control what isn't yours ends badly. Maybe next time you'll think twice before giving away someone else's property." She glared at me, but her fury was impotent. Her friends were now muddy, frustrated, and fully aware that her assurances of permission meant nothing. The water was still receding, and there was nothing they could do to reverse it. My control of the lake spot was complete. I allowed a small smirk to cross my face as I watched Karen attempt to regroup, futilely shouting orders to her friends. The situation had completely flipped. The lake, which had been hers to exploit through HOA authority, was now fully under my domain. Every frustrated shout, every stuck floatie, and every helpless gesture reinforced the message: boundaries are enforced by those willing to act, not by those who issue empty rules. By the time the sun began to dip behind the pine trees, Karen's energy had collapsed into a mix of exhaustion, embarrassment, and anger. She had attempted retaliation and failed spectacularly. The lesson was clear, and my lake was safe. By the next morning, the lake had settled into its new reality, partially drained, the dock grounded, and floatas scattered across the exposed shoreline. Karen's friends, exhausted, muddy, and frustrated, had realized that the lake was no longer their playground. Their laughter from the previous day had evaporated, replaced by awkward silence and hurried attempts to pack up their things. Karen stood at the edge of the mud, her hands on her hips, glaring at the scene. The smirk she had worn when giving away my lake spot was gone, replaced by a mixture of rage, disbelief, and a creeping sense of defeat. "This isn't fair," she spat. "You can't just do this. I'm HOA." I walked toward the dock, boots crunching in the mud, calm and collected. "Fair?" I asked. "Fair would have been respecting someone else's property. You gave my lake spot to your friends without permission. This is just the consequence of ignoring boundaries." Her friends muttered under their breath, glaring at Karen. "She's right," one of them admitted reluctantly. "Maybe we shouldn't have come here." Another slipped, sinking knee-deep into the mud, and swore under his breath. The contrast between Karen's outrage and their silent acknowledgement of reality was stark. I surveyed the exposed lake bed, noting how the lowered water had transformed the landscape. Small rocks, hidden sandbars, and shallow pools now made floating platforms impossible to use. Even if they stayed, the lake was effectively useless for their games. My strategic lowering of the water had worked perfectly. Karen stomped toward me, her voice trembling with fury. "You'll pay for this. The HOA will hear about it." I shook my head. "The HOA already knows I own this property. This is legal. The difference between you and me is that I enforce my rights. You handed others my fun for free. Now you're learning that there are consequences." Her friends began to quietly leave, still slippery and annoyed, casting guilty glances at Karen. She tried to maintain her authority, but it was useless. I could see the shift in her demeanor. Her power over others had evaporated. By mid-afternoon, the lake was completely under my control. The water level remained manageable, the dock was functional only for me, and Karen's attempts to manipulate the situation had failed entirely. The chaos had taught a lesson not just to her friends, but to Karen herself: you cannot exploit someone else's property without repercussions. I leaned against the railing of the dock, watching the lake settle into quiet peace. For the first time in weeks, the space felt like mine again, fully under my control, serene, and untouchable. Karen and her friends had learned a lesson the hard way. Karen wasn't one to accept defeat quietly. By the morning after the chaos, she had returned, pacing along the edge of the dock, glaring at the lake as if sheer willpower could reverse reality. Her friends had mostly left, muttering about mud and wasted fun, leaving her to stew alone in frustration. "This isn't over," she muttered, shaking her fists at the water. "I'm the HOA. I can call the board. They'll—" I interrupted calmly, stepping closer. "The board isn't going to change the law or your trespassing. This is my property, Karen. And as you can see, your authority doesn't override my rights." Her face twisted in rage. "I'll make you pay for this. I'll get everyone on the board too." I raised a hand, stopping her mid-rant. "You're wasting your energy. You already gave away my lake spot without permission. You thought your friends could enjoy it freely, but you miscalculated. You see now what happens when someone ignores boundaries." Karen looked around at the mud-slicked shoreline, the grounded dock, and the partially drained lake. For the first time, she realized the consequences were real and irreversible. Her furious stomping, shouting, and frantic attempts to manipulate her friends had failed completely. I decided to reinforce the lesson further. I approached the manual valve and turned it slightly, lowering the water just enough to make the dock completely unusable. Karen's eyes widened, disbelief overtaking even her anger. She ran forward, trying to stop me, but the terrain was slippery and she stumbled into the mud, splattering herself from head to toe. Her friends, who had lingered nearby out of curiosity, couldn't help but laugh at the absurdity of her situation. Karen's authority had evaporated, replaced by humiliation and frustration. Every attempted retaliation had been anticipated, every move countered. My planning had left no room for her to regain control. Finally, I stepped back and surveyed the scene, the dock grounded, Floidas stranded on mud, Karen's friends slipping and laughing at the chaos, and Karen herself stuck in the middle of her own failed schemes. It was perfect. The lake spot, once compromised by her selfishness, was now fully under my control. By mid-afternoon, she gave up entirely, retreating with one last glare, muttering about complaints, HOA rules, and injustice. But her words had no weight. The lesson had been delivered, the balance of power restored, and the lake spot secured. From that moment on, Karen understood one undeniable truth: messing with someone else's property comes with consequences, and I had ensured they were unforgettable. By the following morning, the lake had fully settled into its new reality. The water level remained lower than usual, just enough to keep the dock grounded and the Floidas useless. Karen's friends had stopped coming, muttering apologies and excuses as they sloshed away through the mud. The lake, once a scene of chaos, was finally under my control again. Karen stood at the edge of the water, fuming quietly, arms crossed. Her attempts to manipulate, intimidate, or reclaim authority had completely failed. She had learned, in the most humiliating way possible, that her HOA title meant nothing when someone was prepared and determined to enforce their rights. I walked slowly along the dock, boots sinking slightly into the mud. The lake bed, partially exposed, revealed hidden channels and sandbars that were now useless to anyone but me. Every step reinforced the message: this was my property, my rules, and I had full control. Karen's interference had ended not with negotiation, but with undeniable action. Her friends lingered at the edge, unsure how to apologize. A few muttered about leaving, still embarrassed by the mud, but they had learned their own lesson. They wouldn't return without permission, and they wouldn't trust Karen's word blindly again. I glanced at Karen. Her fury had dulled into silent resignation. She opened her mouth, perhaps to argue, but no words came. I could see the shift in her posture: defeat, frustration, and the realization that she had underestimated me. For the first time, she had no leverage. The lake, the dock, the shoreline, all were mine to enjoy, uninterrupted. I took a deep breath of the crisp morning air, the scent of pine and lake water filling my lungs. Victory wasn't loud or aggressive, it was quiet, complete, and undeniable. The peace I had fought to reclaim stretched across the water, reflected in the still surface of the lake. Karen's meddling had ended, and my sanctuary was finally secure. By afternoon, I had adjusted the water flow to maintain a level perfect for my use but impractical for anyone else. The dock was stable, the lake peaceful, and every inch of my property was clearly mine. Karen had been taught a lesson she wouldn't forget, and I had demonstrated that boundaries exist for a reason and they will be enforced. Sitting on the dock, I watched the water ripple in the gentle breeze. The sun sparkled on the surface, the air was serene, and for the first time in weeks, the lake felt truly mine again. Karen's interference was gone, her power evaporated, and my weekend sanctuary restored. The lake was calm, the water gently lapping against the grounded dock, reflecting the late afternoon sun like a golden mirror. For the first time in weeks, I felt completely at ease. Karen's interference, her friends' chaotic antics, and the tension that had consumed my weekends were finally gone. My lake spot, my sanctuary, was mine again, undisturbed and secure. I walked along the shore, boots sinking slightly into the soft, exposed sand, inspecting the area. The lowered water had worked perfectly, floatas stranded, platforms grounded, and any potential attempts at unauthorized enjoyment neutralized. My planning, patience, and knowledge of the terrain had paid off flawlessly. Every move Karen had made to manipulate the situation had been anticipated and countered. Karen's friends had left for good, muttering apologies and excuses as they trudged through the mud. Their laughter from previous days had vanished, replaced with frustration, embarrassment, and a newfound respect for boundaries. Karen herself lingered briefly at the edge, glaring at the lake, clearly calculating her next futile move. I watched her retreat, realizing her authority, reputation, and ability to meddle had been stripped completely. The dock, now stable and functional only for my use, became the symbol of my victory. The water levels, carefully managed, ensured my sanctuary was practical, enjoyable, and, most importantly, off-limits to anyone who didn't respect my rights. Every ripple, every reflection, was a testament to the control I had reclaimed. I sat on the dock, breathing in the crisp, pine-scented air, feeling the serenity I had fought to restore. The lake was quiet, undisturbed, and perfectly mine. Karen's attempt to hijack my property had backfired spectacularly. She had underestimated me, ignored boundaries, and handed me the opportunity to demonstrate that privilege and authority are meaningless without respect for others. As the sun dipped behind the treeline, casting long shadows across the water, I reflected on the lessons learned. Standing firm, planning carefully, and taking action when boundaries are crossed isn't just about revenge, it's about protecting what's yours. Karen had learned that the hard way. Her friends had learned that relying on someone else's authority without permission comes with consequences. And I had learned that patience and strategy always prevail over arrogance and entitlement. The lake sparkled in the golden hour, serene, beautiful, and fully under my control. Karen would never interfere here again, and the dock, the water, and the shoreline were my sanctuary, my rules, my peace, my victory.